Hello, everyone. My name is Neo Harder, aka the Farm Boy, and you have reached Farm Boy Meets the World. Thank you guys so much for being here. This is actually our second episode now of the podcast, of the YouTube channel, of this long journey that we're gonna go on together. Thank you guys so much for being here once again. So, in this episode, our second episode, we interviewed Dr. Nicole Cerpa Vielma. Dr. Vielma is an economics professor here at UCSB. However, she's housed in the Global Studies department. And that brings me to the topic of the video, which is globalization, Latin American economics. We spoke in particular about Chile and something called the Washington Consensus. We spoke about how basically since around 1960s, 1970s, the United States of America has had what you can call a hegemonic influence economically on the entire world, and we talked about neocolonialism. I know all of these topics are intense. This is a lot to think about. It's a lot to take in. However, that is what the idea of FBMW is. That's what the idea of this episode is. It's to introduce you guys to these extremely fascinating, extremely complex, and extremely critical topics that need to be discussed. These are the types of things that we discuss on college campuses. I'm a student here at UCSB, and these are the types of things that I think more people should be discussing. So, with that being said, I wanted to address one more thing. As you can probably tell, this video is a little bit informal. FBMW has literally just begun producing content. We have some work to go. I completely understand that, and I am absolutely receptive to all the feedback. I understand that even this introduction video is not that formal. Look at the background right now. I'm a student right now. I'm a full-time student. I also have a part-time barbering job. It's a little bit difficult for me to organize all of these things, but please, 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 please just stick with me. I've had a few really, really, really big and important updates happen in the past couple days that I don't want to reveal too much right now, but I will say this. The podcast is going to be much, much, much better within the next few episodes. Please understand that. This is a process. I'm a student. I'm doing this with only one partner, and we're both extremely busy. But it is our goal to make it better and to improve it, and that will happen. I promise you. We're going to have better guests. We're going to have better quality video, better quality audio, better quality editing. I promise, I promise, I promise. And this podcast will become extremely, extremely professional and successful. You guys just have to watch. The only thing that I ask of you is to subscribe.
The world after 1971 and 1973 broke down from the system that was called the Bretton Woods system, right? So when that era, like between after the Second World War until the 71, 73, was like the golden era of capitalism, of American capitalism. And after that, the world became, it's like when the world started gearing towards neoliberalism, right? And this is where a lot of crises happened, like financial crisis.
And everything else was linked to the dollar.
All the other currencies that were inside of the system were pegged to the US dollar. So when the system broke down, it was a chaos. Nation states are no longer as important as supranational entities. So at the end, I don't think there's much of a conversation between like the IMF and the Chilean government, right? And I would say this is mostly because. So this is why I think it's really important to think of global finance, because this is something that actually motivated the research that I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? Because I was really motivated to the point where I could question, for example, the role that the US has or the US dollar has over the world.
You came here from Leeds University. What was it like arranging your housing here? And
horrible.
Horrible?
Horrible. Like,
how so?
We lived in, I think, in a month or maybe 2 months, we lived in 10 different houses.
Oh my god.
Just to get to the apartment that we are living right now.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So, well, starting of course with like the move from the UK to here, we lived in different Airbnbs because we had a lot of issues with our visas as well, and that took longer than expected. And so yeah, I started there. But here, we first couldn't find any place to stay, so I emailed like people from my department, is anybody who could be like a nice person and just like house us for, I don't know, a weekend, because we
Right.
couldn't find anything that was at a reasonable price. I mean, we could pay like $10,000, but
Yeah, of course. That's yeah.
yeah. So yeah, we stay with, so some friends said, yeah, we can host you for a weekend, and then we went to a hotel, and then we went to another hotel, then we went to an Airbnb. We stayed there like for 6 weeks in Santa Barbara, and then we moved to our apartment here in Goleta.
Interesting. And none of the Airbnb host, they limited the amount of the duration of your guys' stay, right?
Yeah, I mean the one that we stayed was pretty good, and the host was great, so we could extend it if we wanted to,
I
but
see.
it was like very small for us for the price that we could pay as
I
well.
see.
So
Yeah, I
yeah.
understand. I understand. I wanted to begin this interview by clarifying that I want to get to know everything. Not just I don't want to just value you just for your work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Does that
No,
make
that's
sense?
great. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, if you don't mind, can we just talk a little bit about about Chile, Santiago? That's where you were born, correct?
Yeah. So actually, I was born in the south
Uh-huh.
of Chile. I was born in Concepcion, which is like right here. And
Concepcion, yes, I'm
yeah,
sorry. Uh-huh.
no, it's okay. So my family is from the south of Chile. My mom and my dad. Actually, my dad was born a little bit further in the south. My mom was born in Concepcion. So I stayed there until I was 7 or 8. When I was 8, we moved to Santiago, the capital of Chile, for my dad's job. Um, and yeah, so it's kind of a large contrast, I would say, because Santiago is like a very I mean, for Chile, it's a very large cosmopolitan city.
Right.
You have a lot going on as opposed to Concepcion, which is still, it's like one of the biggest cities in Chile, but yeah, it's kind of boring. Yeah.
So, what's really interesting is the move that your family experienced, right, from Concepcion to Santiago, is interesting because it's almost a case study in and of itself of this kind of center periphery thing,
Yeah.
where people move from the periphery to the center, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, if I may ask, what you said it was a job, right?
Yeah.
That your parents or your dad moved for. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so actually we moved in 97, which was when the East Asian crisis hit.
Right.
So my parents work in construction. So they had a construction company. And of course, when there's a crisis, you don't have that demand for like building houses and so on. So my dad is an economist. My mom is the person who is an architect. And so they didn't have much people wanting to build houses. So at the end, they started making a lot of businesses in Santiago, and this is why, yeah,
That
we
makes
had to
sense.
move because the situation with the East Asian crisis was hard.
Yeah, I understand. So the viewers, the people that are going to be watching this, there's going to be an entire range of people from people who know exactly what you're talking about with this East Asian crisis, and then there's going to be obviously many people who have no idea.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so do you mind just explaining a little bit what the crisis was that you're just
Yeah.
referring to?
So, well, I might have to start like really
Yeah, no, of
far
course.
back.
We have plenty of time. I really, yeah, of course.
So the world after 1971 and 1973 broke down from the system that was called the Bretton Woods system, right? So when that era, like between after the Second World War until the 71, 73, was like the golden era of capitalism, of American capitalism, right? Because we didn't experience any crisis in the world, everything was like sound good. And after that, the world became, it's like when the world started gearing towards neoliberalism, right? And this is where a lot of crisis happened, like financial crisis. There was, that era is actually the 70s and the 80s particularly was known as the macroeconomic chaos that came after the Bretton Woods system. So the US kind of, in a way to rescue the American economy, what it did. So we had like different political stages that were happening in that time, along with the UK as well. So, for example, Ronald Reagan, the Paul Volcker as the Fed was elected as the chair of the Fed. We had Margaret Thatcher being elected as the Prime Minister of the UK. All of these things at the end were so this political maybe surrounding was making decisions that led us to think, or them to think, how we can control this unstable economy.
Right.
And they decided to just steer towards neoliberalism, and this is where everything started, right?
So what's interesting about neoliberalism for me is that I guess theoretically, and I would really love for you to correct me, anything where I'm wrong here. Just theoretically, the idea behind neoliberalism is deregulation, to not control the economy,
Yeah.
to not have economic controls and things like that. Now, can you explain to me how the US is able to manipulate this idea of more like freedom, right, to its advantage in terms of, because you say that the reason why the United States employed neoliberalism after these crises, right, was because it would give it a new form of control, essentially.
Yeah.
It would be more secure. So
Yeah.
do you think you can make that a little bit of that logical connection for me?
Yeah. So during this golden era of capitalism, so during the Bretton Woods system, has something to do with the currencies that were used during that time, right? So before the golden era, so it was the British pound, the one that was like the hegemonic currency. Then we came into this Bretton Woods system because the UK couldn't pair up with the exchange rate with the gold, because they were paired to or linked to the gold, their currency. And then it was the United States. So the US dollar was the only currency that was pegged to the gold,
and then everything else was linked to the dollar.
all the
right?
other currencies that were inside of the system were pegged to the US dollar. So
Right.
when the system broke down, it was a chaos. So what stayed in people's minds at the end is that the US dollar was the safest currency. So at the end, this stayed into this crisis, and even with connecting that with the East Asian crisis and with all the crises that happened afterwards, especially in emerging economies, had to do with these economies felt so, because they were having a lot of capital inflows and outflows because of this deregulation era that was going on, that at the end they decided to link their currencies as well to the value of the US dollar, so to have a fixed exchange rate regime.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I think it does make sense.
Yeah.
And so, and that gives, and the idea behind this question was to figure out how that gives the United States power, right? Over, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, so so since it is like that, it is referred in like research that the US dollar came as post-hegemonic hegemon currency, right? Because everybody still thinks that the US dollar has this power. And there's actually a new literature that is referring to this power as currency hierarchy, right?
Currency hierarchy, interesting.
So that it's basically based on Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, a British economist that was so what it says is that we have a pyramid of currencies, and the currency that is at the top is the US dollar, because it's the one that has the highest liquidity premium, which means, what is liquidity premium? It's the easiness that you can dispose an asset, in this case a currency, and convert it into cash without having a significant loss.
I see.
And then from this pyramid, and it's not like so like we have one currencies and then all the currencies at the bottom. It's a pyramid, because there are different currencies that have this easiness more likely to happen, whereas all the other emerging economies currencies sit at the bottom, because those are kind of the subordinated currencies to the one that is at the top.
Right. And so in order to have any sort of, it's difficult when you have that sort of leverage as a nation to have the top currency, right? It's difficult for other nations to I don't know if I want to say bargain with those nations, because it's interesting, because the way that the U.S. dollar, it being at the top, right? It's not as if other nations could trade with any other currency with the United States, for example.
Yeah.
So it forces those other nations to use the dollar if they want to
Yeah.
do any business with the United States, right?
Exactly. So if you actually have a look, there's like a really nice, a really good study that it's from, I think, Prates and De Conti, I think, that are Brazilian economists. They actually looked at all the uses of the currencies of the world as means of payment. So how much do you use the US dollar to pay for either trade or financial investments and so on? And they noticed that the US dollar actually was used in almost since the 2000s, like in 90% of transactions. And that value is even increasing.
90% of transactions.
And then all the other currencies came. But the jump between the US dollar, I think, and then was like the Japanese yen. It's big. So then we have like 30%, and then the other currencies.
Interesting.
We have the British pound, the euro, and then more at the bottom is like the Chinese renminbi, the yuan. Yeah.
Interesting. So, how does the IMF and the World Bank, what was the transition like for them when they went
Yeah.
from, right? Do you
Yes.
understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. So, well, the IMF and the World Bank were created during this, as you said, this Bretton Woods system, and they were actually set up as funds, right? And so the IMF was set up as like helping countries when they had like deficits in terms of trade and currency, because all the currencies were pegged to the US dollar. However, it was a fund; it wasn't a bank, so it didn't. So the resources were limited, right?
Right.
Same with the World Bank. So the World Bank was a fund, but the goal was to help the reconstruction of countries after the war. So that was like the initial idea for these two institutions, right? After the Bretton Woods system, when all these crises started to happen, these institutions stayed as institutions that were giving advice in terms of how to handle the different crises. So particularly in terms of currency, so the IMF is still doing that nowadays. When neoliberalism hit, these institutions became as the voices of
like agents of capitalism almost.
Of neoliberalism.
Of neoliberalism.
Yes, exactly. So they were promoting neoliberalism philosophy, and this is what happened when we come to the Latin American debt crisis in 1982.
Right.
So these countries, because of a sum of other, so they became in debt, but at the same time, they became in debt with the U.S., right? So with U.S. banks. The problem was that during that time, Paul Volcker decided to increase interest rates in the U.S., which made that the debt that these countries had super expensive.
Right.
At the same time, when he did that, the value of the U.S. dollar increased to unprecedented levels. So like
because everyone wants the U.S. dollar at this point, right?
Yeah, and because of interest rate made that the value increased as well, because they wanted to reduce inflation during that time. So that made that the debt that the Latin American countries had was super, like it came from 1 to almost 5 times more,
And
right?
then at this point, when it has a debt directly to the United States, right? During, you said 1982.
Yeah.
And it sounds for like a moment like you wanted to speak about the reasons why they were in debt, and you kind of pulled back just a little bit. I am interested in hearing more about that, the reasons why these nations, especially like Chile, for example, right, was in debt, and then we can go ahead and talk a little bit more about the effects of neoliberalism, how it affected the dynamic of that debt, right?
Yeah.
And so, do you mind just expanding on the reason why Chile and some of these Latin American nations were in debt?
Right. So what was happening? So I'm gonna start with the U.S. first. So what was happening on that side, and then I'm gonna go into Latin America. So because of this chaos that was going on, there were a lot of other institutions that were taking stage during that time, which are like shadow banks, asset managers that posed a lot of competition to US banks, so a lot of competition in terms of disintermediation. That means that these institutions were giving credit or giving, yeah, basically loans to, as opposed to banks. So banks were facing a lot of competition during that time. And so what they did, and because of neoliberalism, they managed to break out so many of the restrictions that were placed since the Depression era. And they decided to broaden their scope of clients to other regions of the world. And in this case, it was Latin America and also East Asian countries.
That makes sense. Actually, that makes perfect sense. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
And so they started giving loans, using a lot of financial innovation to be able, because banks have a very strict regulation in terms of liquidity and in terms of the loans that they can give based on their capital and their liabilities, right? However, they started to do a lot of innovations on the liability side of that, so in terms of their debts and their assets, so that they could give at the end more loans, right? So that they can show to regulators everything is fine in our balance sheets.
And they're just, at this point, they're basically just expanding their customer base, right? And they're looking for people in Latin America who want debt, right, essentially, because they're looking, we're looking at I don't want to say a third world nation, but an underdeveloped nation compared to the United States. We have, in other Western areas, we have people in this area that are basically wanting to improve, wanting to develop, and they're looking for debt.
Yeah, and so that was actually the idea that the theory was saying. So these countries are kind of underdeveloped, and I think the problem with these theories is that they always think, so more like kind of neoliberal theories, is that they are seeing, for example, that Latin American economies or that developing nations have a problem that they need to fix, whereas something that is inherent in capitalism, right? So that was the idea in that point. So they need this capital because they need to develop their financial systems, their economic system, their industries, and so on. So they needed the capital, and so in that sense. And this is why this capital started flowing into these economies at cheaper rates than when the crisis hit. They became in debt, but the problem was at the end that interest rates were really, really high, and the value of the US dollar was high as well. So these countries became bankrupt, as well as US banks.
As the US is increasing its interest rates, and then as demand for the US dollar is increasing, it just makes it impossible for these nations to pay off their debts.
Exactly. And so the package that came for the US was completely different for Latin American economies, and that was promoted by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And this is where, like, the final stage where neoliberalism consolidates into these economies.
So what's really interesting here is, for the nations, was there no system regulating the United States' actions, in the sense that it seems like usury almost, it seems like they're faulting on their debts, and part of the reason that they faulted on their debts was because the United States, and this, from my understanding, kind of unethically manipulated the dynamic to make it impossible, right?
Yeah.
And so, what are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I kind of agree.
Right.
So, for me, like, this kind of manipulation is just maybe not manipulation, might not be the word, but it's like pushing for deregulations that were suiting for their needs at the end. So, for example, if banks wanted to broaden their client scope because they needed to increase their profits because they were facing with so much disintermediation during that time, then this is what they were pushing for. So they were pushing for deregulations, and neoliberalism was like kind of authorizing them to do that, right? So they were giving a lot of privileges in terms of what businesses they could conduct. For example, now it's so before the neoliberalism era, banks had very tight regulations in terms of what businesses they could conduct. This ended in 1999 with it's the Financial Modernization Act here in the U.S., where dissolved these barriers between different businesses such as insurance businesses, such as asset management, such as banking, and these were allowed to be in one institution. So at the end, they could spread that into the world as well. And this is actually what we know nowadays as the modern banking, like as a universal bank, right? Um, so yeah, maybe I deviated a little bit from the question, but
No, I think it's great, yeah. And so we're talking about, I just want to understand that, I want to understand the trajectory of everything. So at this point, we're looking at 1982, right?
yeah,
And then at this point, in 1982, the U.S. has increased the interest rates, the demand for the dollar has increased, deregulation has already began, obviously, in these Latin American nations. It would have really started to begin in like during the, for example, in Chile during the dictatorship, right? Like the
yeah,
whole idea behind it was just
yeah,
was
yeah,
basically just to provide the economic landscape to allow deregulation. And so I guess what I want to know is what's next in the story, like not in the
yeah.
story, but in the
So
trajectory.
yeah, so you have to understand that the neoliberalism that, or first like monetarism was called, that was like the policies that were applying these economies were in different stages. And you have to understand that this is in the context of the Cold War as well.
Right.
So
I was going to ask you about that. Go
yeah,
ahead.
so these kind of experiments in terms of neoliberal policies started in the 50s and the 60s in these countries. So testing some countries, hey, what happens if we apply these policies to these economies? Then came all the dictatorships in like almost every Latin American nation.
Right.
And this is where um, a lot of nations also were pushed to adopt certain neoliberal policies, right? Especially the case of Chile, it's like the case of the pure neoliberalism experiment, because of the extent that neoliberal policies were conducted. And it also coincides with so the 1982 Latin American debt crisis, that was like the final stage for applying this neoliberal perspective, because it came as a stabilization package. So you misbehaved as Latin American countries, so now you have to pay the price and just adopt these other policies so that markets can develop, because you have a lot of intervention of your government, of your institutions, and we need to reduce that in order that you can be developed markets, right? And just open the frontiers of your economies, of your finances to the world, to foreign ownership, to foreign trade, to foreign financial transactions. And this is how it closes this neoliberal perspective within these economies. I mean, it still continues nowadays. We still see neoliberalism applied in these economies, and particularly in Chile as well. It's been super hard to get rid of. For example, in Chile, we still have a constitution written in 1980 when the dictatorship was taking place, and we had a whole like big project that started in 2019, to get rid of this constitution, because it was like eroding all the society that we know nowadays. Inequality is like rising, and I can get into that.
I do want to discuss that.
But the problem is it's so ingrained like in all society that it started like a good project, but then it was rejected. Then we drafted a new constitution that was rejected as well. So it's like, yeah, we're still stuck up with the 1980s constitution that nobody likes, but we don't seem to find a way to unify our thoughts to get rid of neoliberalism.
When it's getting rejected, who's it getting rejected by, and who has the agency? Is it the IMF and the World Bank who are still able to? Sorry, go ahead.
No. Yeah. So this was a project that was brought up by people, and the people that wrote the first constitution were actually elected by people, so it was a very democratic process. And it wasn't drafted by the same people that are
had been in power at the time.
Power and politics and all that. So it was really elected by anybody could run to write this, right? And they were elected, and they did. They drafted a constitution. And then the same people were like reading this constitution. The media also played like a big role there. And at the end, it was decided by but by every one of us Chileans, if we wanted to have that constitution or not, and it was rejected.
And it was rejected.
And then the second one that was drafted was written by people that were in politics, and yeah, so but that was still rejected.
So the idea of the Constitution, actually, just the theme of democracy and representation, kind of encapsulates my next question, honestly. So prior to the full neoliberalization of Chile, right? Inequality, like in Chile, and what was it like after the neoliberalization phase?
Yeah. So, well, I was born actually in '89, so I actually don't know anything before. I mean, of course, what I read, but my
Yeah.
experience has been that Chile has always been a very unequal country in all of the senses. So not only economic inequality, but also access in terms of access to healthcare, to education, to decent pensions, to literally any public service that you would think of, because the state intervention was so reduced during neoliberalism that this is something that still applies nowadays, and that fracture also the society, right? And yes, you have like these um, very promoters of neoliberalism, not only in Chile but in the world, that of course the interests um, of them, it's not necessarily the benefit of everybody, right?
Right.
And maybe that aligns more with what global investors would like. But at the same time, there's a lot of people that, at least in Chile and I would say Latin America, that um, can access to decent healthcare, education, even pensions, like old age poverty.
It's still like that, you suggest?
Yeah, no, definitely still like. I mean, the 2019 Constitution project started because there was a social outbreak, because people were tired of this situation. That
So
yeah.
what is the government doing if the people? Because let me preempt it a little bit by saying, and I really mean this, guys, when I'm looking at the audience. The reason I have these books here is because I've been reading a lot about the globalization, and then this kind of everything that you're saying. It's so interesting because there's a lot of themes going on here, and there's a lot of continuity in the literature, of course, because it's fact. You know what I mean? But what's interesting is it's like, as I see things like the World Trade Organization, right, and then as I see things like the World Bank and the IMF, and even trade agreements like NAFTA, and even things like the EU, they seem more and more, and especially after the 1970s and 80s, like they're really just agents for neoliberalism, right?
Yeah.
And neoliberalism doesn't necessarily, it's not geared towards, as we just mentioned, as we just went off on this tangent about, it's not geared towards benefiting the lower stratas of society. And what I find difficult is the task of the governments have essentially become fundamentally altered after neoliberalism. I've always thought that the government, part of the idea behind government, right, partly was to, I mean, a major part was to protect the citizens, was to, especially democracy, like that's the idea of democracy.
Yeah.
It's part of the idea of democracy. And so it makes me wonder, what are these governments really doing if they're not protecting the lower stratas of society, and these multinational corporations at this point, which are using these massive transnational entities, right, to spread neocolonialism and to spread corporate power. What is the role of the government in Chile, and what do you think the role should be?
Yeah, it's just it's complicated because it's not like the government doesn't want to respond to their people. I believe that state governments are kind of subordinated to what is going on in the global economy. So at the end, that is determining, and in global finance. So at the end, for me, that is determining the political space that nation states have, right? So yes, in one hand, there are a lot of attempts, especially like in the government it's that we have right now in Chile with Boric and so on. He really had it in my perspective, good approaches to kind of solve kind of these still like this neoliberalism consequences that we're seeing nowadays. However, there's a lot of other things going on that are not fully dependent on Chile or even Latin America, because these economies are very subordinated to what is going on in like as external factors in the global economy and the global finance, right? Um, and and yeah, I forgot where I wanted to.
It's okay. No, I
Yeah.
understand. It's how do you think Chile can improve in in for one creating legislation, right, and policy that protects the lower stratas of society while also kind of like, if you understand what I'm saying, getting the best of both worlds here, where they're still upholding their responsibility to the people, but also guaranteeing investors that Chile is a good place and a deregulated place to invest in.
Wow, that's a tough question.
I'm sorry.
uh, so I mean, it depends, because you have on the one hand the interests of local investors that are really important for an economy like Chile. However, how these capitals are flowing into these economies doesn't depend necessarily on what is going on in Chile, right, or in Latin America. It
As you
depends
mentioned, yeah.
a lot on global conditions. So investing in countries like Chile or Latin American economies, it's like the cherry on the top. It's like, so, oh, well, we want to diversify a lot because we have a lot of capital. What do we do with this capital? If there's the case, there's a lot of liquidity going on in the world, then they will invest in riskier assets like Latin America. And especially Latin America would have to offer very attractive interest rates to these investors so that this capital flows there. So in order for this to happen, you have to have like the easiness I was saying of if these capitals want to go, then you would have to have these barriers like very low. So kind of like adopting a very neoliberal approach.
You see, capital flight, I don't like that.
Yeah.
I mean, no one does. I don't like the idea of corporations being able to just flee the area whenever they feel like they want to.
Yeah.
It has a lot of implications for the rest of society when they do that. Do you think, I don't know if this even is a thing right now, but one thing that I was considering in the past is something as simple as a kind of an investment guarantee, for example. Like, if a nation or if a private entity wants to invest in Chile in some deregulated capacity, one regulation would be that capital flight wouldn't be acceptable for like maybe 10 years or something like that, right?
Yeah. So
Is that even viable? Is that something that other people
no,
have thought
yeah,
about?
even like there are capital controls in place in well, in Argentina, in Chile, yes, but still it's like that is like increasing a restriction for global investors.
People want to invest less. The only way that that'd be possible is if everyone kind of agreed to something like that,
Yeah,
right?
and as I was saying, so since these countries are like the cherry on the top, or like the flavor of ice cream that they're gonna pick for, I don't know, destabilize. If you do that, then these capitals might not even go and invest in these economies,
Not
which
at
could be
all.
also a good thing, right? Um, but but yeah, so capital controls are in place already, but this still finds a way. So this capital still finds a way of destabilizing currencies and economies per se, as the case of Argentina, of course. It's yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so how did you first become interested in economics?
Yeah, so well, it has a lot to do with what we have been discussing.
I
So
imagine.
for me, it was like, on the one hand, I could perceive a lot of inequality in every aspect of my life in the country. I could see the structure that the society has even nowadays, and I wanted to understand this why are we seeing so much inequality? But on the other hand, you have like Chile is being portrayed to the Chilean people, to Latin America, and to the world like one of the most successful cases of neoliberal policies applied. And for me, success doesn't look like this, like inequality, right? So it didn't make sense in my head. So I really wanted to understand the root of this, like what is going on? Why do we have, on the one hand, politics, and all that saying that this is like the best successful case, whereas this is not what I'm seeing, right?
Right, right.
So I decided to study economics in Chile for that, but then I realized that economics is very segregated into what we call mainstream economics and heterodox economics.
Okay.
And this is something that I didn't know when I was in Chile, because the way that economics is taught in Chile has this efficiency paradigm rooted in it, right? So it's kind of a very mainstream way of seeing. So it's kind of the way, well, these economies have these problems, this is what we need to fix, and these are the solutions, these are the theories, these are the models.
And that's mainstream economics, of course.
Yeah, that's mainstream economics. So for the people that are looking at me, that may be sorry. For me, yes, for heterodox economists like me, this is what mainstream economics is. So after I studied there, I realized this is still not making sense, right? This is not explaining what I'm seeing. And this is mostly because this perspective, in my opinion, leaves power out of the equation, right? And this is something that for me it's crucial in the relationships that we see when we talk about the world and when we talk about nation states as well. So then I decided to go to the UK because they are known for having like a more pluralist kind of view of economics. So I researched a lot of the different programs that could give me that, and I found that the University of Leeds, so that university had really great people and also a very pluralist way of looking at these phenomena and also in economics. So this is where I learned that there's this other side of economics that wasn't being taught in universities, maybe a little extent in the University of Chile in Chile, but all the other universities just ignores this big important part of economics that would, and I wouldn't, some people call it like political economy because it has a lot to do also with policies, right? So what happens in the public space when we incorporate variables such as power. So how do we explain capitalism, for example, from this perspective, which is, yeah.
Do you mind just, I think I'm understanding you, but I want to be able to make this very easy to grasp for everyone and for myself a little bit as well. Can you just describe, you said that the power dynamics for one is just one variable that you have to, which makes a big difference between mainstream economics and heterodox economics.
Yeah.
Do you mind just describing what it is about maybe about power and or heterodox versus mainstream economics that kind of that defines that big difference? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's hard to explain it, but I think maybe I can say that for mainstream economics, what they have in mind is that one size fits everybody. So if we do one policy, then that would serve for everybody, because
like
they're not
like the Washington consensus.
Exactly. And this is actually the main difference between because they were trying to put these policies to all Latin American countries that have such a different, so they are so heterogeneous in terms of economic structures, financial structures, and then after the Washington consensus, of course,
post-Washington,
they realized that this didn't work, and then the policies applied to East Asian countries were different. But still, it's like this perspective that if we do this with under these, for me, the assumptions that they follow are not realistic.
Now I understand it. I can grasp it now. Sorry, go ahead. Please continue.
For example, they so some people are assuming, so some mainstream economists are assuming that people are rational, that make rational decisions based on the information that they have, and if they do this decisions at the end, markets are going to be efficiently. So they're going to be in equilibrium, and all the resources are going to be efficiently allocated, right? So this is why I understand where this is coming from, that one size fits all, because if everybody starts doing the same decisions under this rationality paradigm and they open their markets, then markets are going to be efficient. However, they are not, I lost the, so yeah, it's basically like thinking that, right, yeah. So this was like very evident during the global financial crisis, right? So we have people making irrational decisions, right? So they are not, even though the information is there, they are not understanding what is going on. So then all these other like heterodox economies that were like, they exist in schemes. So this is like since 1930s, right? So that, but then during monetarism and neoliberalism, this kind of other perspective went quiet. Um, and then what they are saying is, well, people are not rational, people are not making, so markets are not efficient, markets are not in equilibrium, they're in constant disequilibrium, right? We can find equilibriums in some markets, but not in all of them. So this is not going to happen. And also, with the issue of power, is like, it's not going to work because certain economies are subordinated to others. So we have distinct cases where the policies that could be applied should need to be different because of the subordination that these economies are suffering.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at the heterodox model as opposed to the, I suppose, the mainstream model, right? Which approach do like things like the World Bank, right, and things like the IMF, normally they would approach the mainstream. They would approach with a mainstream viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Do we typically see from nations that, because essentially what I'm understanding is that nations are almost always, as an individual entity, going to approach things heterodoxically, if the government does indeed have the interest of its people at heart, right? You're going to see the approach to integration from a heterodox viewpoint, and then from the other way, from the mainstream side, you're literally going to see the mainstream viewpoint. And so, is there a confrontation when two entities like the World Bank and, for example, Chile, or another nation that wants help from the World Bank, what type of conflict do we have when we see them come together and talk about negotiations and things like structural adjustment, right?
So actually, that's, in my opinion, nation states are no longer as important as supranational entities, right?
I agree with you. That's literally what this whole book is about.
Right. So at the end, I don't think there is much of a conversation between like the IMF and the Chilean government, right? And I would say this is mostly because everything is based. So the stability of the currency, the stability of the economy, everything is built upon confidence, which is like an approach that heterodox economists put forward. So if there's no confidence in the economy, no confidence in the world economy, no confidence in the currency or the institutions that are backing up that currency, then you're still going to have instability in the economy. So in cases like Argentina, the IMF has to come and say everything is going to be fine, please trust this currency, right? And then the market stabilize again, kind of. So I don't see it as being as a conversation.
I see.
Most as like we have to take what the IMF is saying. If not, our economy is gonna go
out the window.
Yeah.
Not to mention, we learn this obviously in classes, in the global studies classes all the time, and it kind of describes it in this book. The power dynamics are just insane, because if you are at the point where you're approaching the World Bank, if you're at the point where you're approaching the IMF, so and I'm thinking about the approach of Chile, right, to this entire thing. What type of other resources do they have before they get to the IMF, before they get to the World Bank, for putting their economy back on track? You know, because obviously we learned that this is the last resort, but I wonder if it's the only option that a lot of them have.
Yeah. It's supposed to be that we have control of the monetary policy, which is something that the central bank
should be doing.
Use it to stabilize the economy. However, in my perspective, it really depends on what is going on in the world. So how the monetary policy is going to work, if it works. Well, fiscal policy is also like a really good tool. I would say like the best tool to approach.
I mean, like manipulating interest rates and things like that, right?
So that's like the monetary policy.
Monetary policy.
So so for example, we have a lot of inflation, and we want to like slow down the economy. We want to take out all the liquidity that is like circulating. central banks might increase interest rates, for example, or decrease interest rates in case they want to just stimulate the economy again. The problem is that, in my perspective, at least, I have the view that banks still have a room of decision between they want to listen to the central bank or not, because the central bank is the one that is setting the interest rates to banks, like to the interbank market. But banks can either adopt that interest rate and lower or increase it, or just do something different, right?
Interesting. And do you find that that happens often in places like?
Not really, but during the global financial crisis, that did happen, and this is why, because everything is based on confidence at the end of the day. So, for example, the interbank market dried up, even though the central bank was lowering and lowering the interest rate. That happened here in the U.S. And banks at the end didn't want to give loans because they didn't trust the economy, right? So they were actually expressing their, I would say, liquidity preference. Like they didn't want to give out loans, right? And sometimes this could happen when we have times of crisis like this, where monetary policy is like being inefficient because banks are not listening to what the central bank is saying. And this could intensify in the future if economies and global finance becomes more and more complex. And because there's this distrust. For example, what happens if cryptocurrencies, for example, come into play, right? What it's going to do to the confidence of investors? There's no government backing them up, so they're very risky. So there's no lender of last resort. So what happens if the economy collapses? Because imagine the case that everybody accepts cryptocurrencies as a means of payment, so that means that this is the currency that is circulating. Maybe banks won't trust, or maybe people even won't trust what is going on and won't listen to the central bank, and then monetary policy again is ineffective, right?
So I understand now. This is one reason why the dollar is so valuable throughout the world, is because it does have that security associated with it. How much power would you say the Fed has?
A lot. Yeah.
Right.
Especially for subordinated economies like Latin American economies.
Right.
Yeah. So everything
like almost more power than the president, like proxy power, I would say almost.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So any decision that the Fed makes is going to mobilize global investors, and that would mean that global capital is going to be mobilized into or out of these economies. That destabilizes their economies. So there's a lot of power going on, because any decisions that the Fed is making could destabilize currencies in these economies, and also the financial system and the economy itself. So
do you think, this is a little bit of a slightly philosophical, but it's very pertinent. When the Fed is making decisions regarding monetary policy, right? How much responsibility do you think that the Fed should be taking for the fact that it does have effect on myriad other nations? Because can I ask also another kind of two-part? What is the dynamic of effects of movements that the Fed makes, right, or adjustments that the Fed makes on domestic as opposed to the other nations, right? Is it almost? Sorry, go ahead. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So no, there's a large debate on this, because there's a lot of research pointing, or literature pointing, that so the Fed has a responsibility with the rest of the world, because it's not only that they are stabilizing their economy. The US dollar is the global currency, right?
Absolutely.
So it has a responsibility which is not, in my opinion, is being overlooked by,
That's exactly
by the
what
Fed.
I was thinking.
And well, yeah, I mean, if I were in the Fed and I want to stabilize my economy, I would say, okay, let's do what is best for the US,
For
right?
the US, yeah.
But it still needs to consider that this is the currency that is being used globally in trade and in financial transactions, right? So anything that it decides, it's gonna stabilize, or not stabilize, but destabilize the world, right?
I understand. One humongous meal later. The last thing we discussed, right, was ways that one of the last things we discussed was ways that different nations can protect themselves. And we talked about monetary policy, fiscal policy. But before we went to that, we were discussing which in and of itself these policies are kind of an approach to the heterodox model because it's not the mainstream option. But we the way we introduced the heterodox model, even the topic was your epistemic community, your not the group of people who had that sort of perspective in Leeds, right? And so can you give me a little bit can you talk a little bit more about that, about what it was like in Leeds being a student, and then why you chose Leeds as opposed to other institutions?
Yeah, so it's just I have found, um, yeah, I really miss Leeds and the community there. I think the economics department there is amazing. If anybody has the chance to wants to study economics, please do it there because I think the community there is like very friendly, and so I really enjoyed my time being there. The courses were very provocative and very skeptical of global finance, of global economics, and economic theory as it has been taught nowadays. So this is something that actually motivated the research that I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? Because I was really motivated to the point where I could question, for example, the role that the U.S. has or the U.S. dollar has over um, the world, right? And especially in Latin American economies. Um, so on that perspective, uh, I think it gave me like a really solid theoretical base, so that I could start questioning everything, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you did you have a mentor in particular at Leeds who benefited you that you
Yeah.
want to describe, and then can you talk about what the importance maybe of mentorships are?
Yeah, so my mentor, that was actually my advisor in my master thesis and then my PhD thesis, was well, Professor Gary Dimsky. He actually is American, but he went, I think, like 15 years ago to the UK. He used to work here at the UC system. He was in the economics department at Riverside,
Oh.
and he has this perspective of economics that it used to be in that economic department from what he has told me. And that kind of reduced a long time. And this is why, and along with other factors as well, he decided to migrate to the UK. So he was like amazing. Like he really cared about his students. He
That's good.
really yeah, he took a really big responsibility on all of us, like all of his PhD students. So, and also afterwards as a friend, right? So he became my friend, he and his wife. So yeah, I really miss him. Also, another person is Professor Anina Kaltenbrunner. She wasn't actually involved during my research, but so when I was doing my PhD, but she was part of my panel when I had to defend my PhD thesis. So she is like the person. If you want to like learn about global finance, global economics, just read her research. She's amazing, like great. She's like going into the
What's her name?
detail. Anina Kaltenbrunner.
Anina Kaltenbrunner.
Yeah.
I'll probably get the spelling from you after.
Yeah, but so her papers are what inspired most of the research that I'm doing nowadays.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And is this is Anina Kaltenbrunner? This is a woman, right?
Yeah.
That actually perfect segue into the next kind of big theme that I really want to discuss with you is what it is like being a woman in academia. And yeah, I just wanted yeah, that's it. I want to leave it as general as possible so that you can tell me
Yeah.
from your perspective.
I think the world has changed a little bit in terms of what voices are being heard. Still hasn't made the change, and it depends on what type of the world you're talking about, where you can find these spaces, especially in economics. It's like as a field, it's maybe hard to find women as an example of like who do you want to follow, right? And for me, she was like one of these examples. Because she's like super successful in terms of like research, her profession, and all that. And she's also a mother, if I'm allowed to say that, to share that with the world. But for me, that was like very inspiring because it's like you usually think that women, especially in academia, can do both or everything, right? Or there's always the concern that there's something that you might have to lose. And I don't know. I think she is like my example that you can do both. And it's weird me saying that because it's like this is not something that would be a question for men, right? Men are also parents, right?
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so it's been hard, especially because I felt that I always have to prove myself more, and because sometimes especially being a woman coming from Latin America and speaking in spaces where economics is so white and male dominated, it kind of makes me feel sometimes that what I have to say is not really relevant, or that I'm afraid of speaking.
Really?
Yeah.
It's interesting. You feel that way even now after having achieved such a high degree of education.
Sometimes, yeah.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I'm scared of like putting myself to the spot, just because of this. Well, maybe because also I come from, yeah, Chile is a very, I don't know, it's just a male-dominated country, very sexist, and being a woman there. I used to work in the private sector before starting an academic career, and in there it was really, really hard that being heard, right? So, for example, I used to work in a company, and sometimes I had good ideas, but the the director didn't hear me because they were coming from me, and I had to tell like other male colleagues to just spell out my ideas so that they could be heard.
That's terrible.
And yeah, this is maybe something that stuck with me, and this is why maybe I feel the way I feel. Yeah.
How do you feel about education being an equalizer? Do you think that education is a strong equalizer? And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. So yes, I think education is the key to do it, but especially if you have pluralist education, right? So that you learn about the different perspectives, that you learn about different people as well, speaking like different people of color, different people like women, men, like different genders as well. So it's I think it's really important to hear these voices that are not usually put on the spot, because their histories and their research might be motivating other people to get into either academia, research, or the job that they want to do. Yeah.
How did your parents feel about your career as in becoming an economist and becoming a professor and things like that?
Yeah, well, they're very proud, yes.
Of course.
Yeah, really happy. Of course, my mom is always sad because I live far away from her. But yeah, no, they're super proud that I came. So my dad is also an economist.
Right, you mentioned that.
And he actually wanted to go and study in the U.S., but he didn't have the means to do that. So he's really, really proud that I'm here nowadays as well. Yeah.
Do your do you find that because your dad is this different generation of economists as you, do you disagree on some topics?
On everything.
On everything, really?
Yeah, he's very much on the mind of what we call mainstream economics. So yeah, so I avoid discussing certain topics when we are together, like in dinners, because if not, that's gonna turn into like
an argument.
Yeah, because we have different perspectives. Even though he's very open nowadays to understand where I'm coming from, the theories that are behind, because he also realizes the inequality and everything that is going on in the world, right? So I think it's like the generation. It's not because they're like in this way because I think they're in this way because they were brought up in this way, right? So the theories that they were taught were the ones that were prevailing while they were growing up, right? And this is why they thought at least that it was correct. And yeah, but their minds are changing. I mean, are open. This is what the feeling that I get when I speak with my dad and other economists of the age. Yeah.
So the University of Leeds is one example of a university that actively pushes forward the heterodox model, right? And kind of combats the mainstream ideology of economics. Do you find that it has become it has become more so of a trend that other universities, as of recently, have adopted this type of model?
Yeah.
And when you're teaching, do you take it? You probably subconsciously and consciously want to push forward this model more, right?
Yeah, so there are other universities here in the US, in the UK, also in Chile. I've got some connections with universities that are pushing towards this model of thinking in economics and even in sociology. So after the global financial crisis, these theories came like to importance because they were explaining, they were giving actually explanations why we see crisis like the one like the global financial crisis. Why are crises being global nowadays instead of like uh, in regions or even in
Like
nations?
insulated crises.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I think this is an approach that has been taking a lot of force just because it gives you another perspective of understanding the fragility that the world has been built upon. And when I teach, I try to be very pluralist as well. So I teach my students to think like all the theories that are there, and just to
Mm-hmm.
be, well, what do you like? So if you think this makes sense, then please go ahead and of course do it. If you think this other approach makes sense, please do it as well. So just, but what I try to push forward in my classes is to think critically of all the theories, because what I'm saying, heterodox economics in the context right now works, but might not work in the future, right? So I
Right.
think one of the best ways of understanding maybe economics is to, um, or to do economics, is to do it as we do it right now, not
Mm.
in the history of
Right.
economics, right?
It's really interesting to hear about the evolution of of I guess you can say of just literally a branch of a study, right? Just the study of economics, the field of economics, to see the evolution of it, where the heterodox model, obviously, as you're saying, as you're suggesting, has become much more prevalent now. Was it? Have we seen anything like the heterodox model prior to like the 1960s and 70s when?
Yeah, so in the 1930s, it wasn't like the heterodox model per se, because I think that's just like a concept that maybe was like put forward in the 80s. But so Keynes was actually the person that all these heterodox approaches, not all of them, because the Marxist political economy is based on Marx, and we have different, yeah, schools of thought. But of course, it came from before the 60s. Yeah, so this is how it has been evolving, and even before, even maybe. Yeah.
Some the U.S., the World Bank, and some deficit spending, which I think is interesting. So I actually have this one written down here. When you look at the World Bank and its data for the U.S., you obviously see an increase in deficit spending precipitously after 2000, which and we saw this after the end of the Vietnam or during the Vietnam War as well. And I'm interested, how do you think that these trends play into the U.S.'s strategy for global finance?
Right. So the US is the only country that is allowed to have like this double deficits in the balance of payments and in the fiscal, because it's like it has all the monetary power at the end. So that gives them this exorbitant privilege of doing so, right? Um, so yeah, I think that is in contrast to all of other economies in the world that are not allowed to do something like that, and it's just because of the control or the hegemony that the U.S. dollar has and over the world, right?
How do you feel about deficit spending for for an economy like the one like the United States is, for example? I know that this is a question that you have to approach from different angles. How do you feel about deficit spending in the United States? Is that a good strategy? I mean, is it the only? Is I don't even know if that's a correct way to phrase the question. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, it depends on what the U.S. is spending their so it's a difficult question because, for example, I don't know any other country that spends so much capital on militarizing their country economy. So I assume that this is like a huge spending of the U.S., which is, I mean, I don't want to get into like the decisions of if they're doing it correctly or not because
It's like a It's more.
yeah. So in contrast, Chile doesn't have that spending. For example, I don't think any Latin American economies have like that big factor of spending. And in terms of like the balance of payments, so there's like a lot of outflow of capital and inflow of capital. So the U.S. is making active investments in the rest of the world. It's also like the currency that everybody is using for trade. So it's giving a lot of capital into the world as well, right?
What would you say that? Actually, let me think for just a moment. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your approach to economics, right? You described your approach to economics as being a little bit more, or being influenced by the heterodox model, right? But do you think that you can go a little bit further in describing just your approach to economics? And yeah, just can you give me a little bit more about your approach to economics?
Yeah, so this approach, heterodox approach, um, considers, and I myself consider that liquidity is key, is the most important thing that mobilizes basically everything. So that's why for me the issue of the US dollar, the issue of power is key for Latin American economies because global liquidity moves according to what the US says and does. And that means that liquidity in these economies is determined by the decisions that the global economy is making. And if there's liquidity or not in these economies, that entails different approaches to policies for these economies, which for me, it's kind of like this is the expression of subordination at its most, so at the most, because it's like if you have liquidity, if you have foreign currency, or if you have capital in these economies, you're able to do certain things that you weren't being able to do if you didn't have this capital, for example, right? So for me, the issue of liquidity is one of the most important thing, and also the issue, my approach is like the issue of power, and how every relationship it is like from at the micro level, at the institutional level, at the macro level, and at the global level, it's determined by this subordination of relationships. Yeah. So for me, these two ideas are key into what I do. Yeah, this is what I incorporate in my research. Yeah.
Okay, great. I would like to know, why do you think it's important for people to be concerned with global finance? And then I also wanted to ask you about how investors in the United States, people who maybe those middle classes, like we spoke about a little bit, should be thinking about their future in this globalized, in the integrated global market. And I guess the specific that I'm looking for here is how American investors should be thinking about their future.
Yeah, so I think these two questions go in hand because global finance or finance in general has taken a weight that it's bigger than any other sector. So this is what we refer to the phenomenon of financialization. Everything has become financialized. So the growth, the weight of finance has become more important in different levels. So for example, if we talk about the financialization of, let's say, a controversial example, like if education, everybody's like taking, for example, loans in order to get into college or university. Financialization of non-financial corporations is like means that these corporations are acquiring this shareholder value orientation, that everything has to be measured in terms of financial metrics, and also these firms are getting in depth in financial markets. So this makes that all the sectors of the economy are very interconnected. So if there's a crisis going on in the banking sector or the financial sector, that is going to easily be spread into all of the other sectors as well. So this is why I think it's really important to think of global finance, because of the interconnectedness of every aspect of the economy. And in terms of the advices that I could give, well, since finance has become so important nowadays, there is a rising inequality gap that is it is being in the sense of people that are working in the financial sector. These people are getting richer and richer every time. So the gap actually is not increasing because we have a portion of the population that is it's losing. Well, they are still, but it's not because this portion of the population is it's in a low income kind of it's because
People are getting richer. People
people
aren't
are getting
necessarily
richer.
getting poorer.
Yes,
I
so
see.
more people are getting richer if they're gonna go in the financial, if they work in the financial sector. So this gives you kind of a hint that if you're not in the financial sector, you're gonna be left behind,
Stagnant, right?
Yes. So I think it is important to invest. Yes. It's of course super difficult in an economy like the one that we are experiencing right now, because for investing, you need capital. And nowadays, with prices, with rents that are so crazy, food prices and everything, it's very little capital that we can have for investing. So at the end, it's kind of a vicious cycle that only the people that can invest is the people that are already rich, right? My advice would be, any little amount of money that you have, try to put it in a safe investment so that you would have something at least that grows there.
Begin to work with.
While if you're still working in the real sector, as we economists call it, like the productive, the economic sector, right?
And then, as you mentioned, in order for Americans not to find themselves being essentially left behind and things like that, it's very, very important to, one, build up your capital pool, right? But then also be able to even access that capital pool comes with a certain amount of either education and or experience.
Yeah.
And so I feel like even before the step before even building up your capital pool would be, you have to get educated in some capacity.
Exactly. Yeah. So financial education, I think, is key for escaping the economy as we see it nowadays. So I think it's really important to educate on what you can invest, like how do we start investing, right? So who to go to, like, should I go like to my financial markets by myself? Like, no, you usually go to an asset manager. But also you have to be aware of the fees that these asset managers are charging you. So I wouldn't suggest to go like to this, I don't know, it's a trade-off, right? Because if you go to the big asset managers,
like Fidelity, for example,
yeah, they're going to charge you maybe a higher fee, but they would maybe have more information on where you can allocate your investments. So I don't know, I don't want to like say this is what you have to do, but just get educated in terms of like what type of asset manager or what type of manager you would like to have for your money, what the fees, what are the different investments that where you can allocate your portfolio. There are very secure investments and very risky investments. Of course, risk gets more profits, but it depends on your tolerance as well. Of course, if you're going to invest money as well, that means that you can't access that money for a period of time so that you can get a profit from it. Yeah. And you would have to pay taxes on the profits as well. So,
How do you feel about things like government bonds and government notes and things like that as a viable investment strategy?
Yeah, so government bonds are the safest,
of course,
bonds. This is what, yeah, so, but there's a lot of demand for government bonds as well, especially US Treasury bills or bonds. because, and it's not only demand from people, so institutions, everybody would like these papers because at the end it gives you liquidity as an institution in your balance sheets. So maybe going for shares of corporations, like packages of shares of corporations that are very, very not risky, like that that their value is going to increase in time, that they're not going to be bankrupt in I don't know, 5 years, stuff like that.
So this is a moral imperative that I'm having personally. So what I wanted to say was the military industrial complex, right? The United States, if you look at like the Pentagon budget and you look at things like that, it's excessive, to say the least. There's a well-known phenomenon going on where basically these corporate or these contractors, right? These military arms contractors have basically guaranteed demand from the government. And if you have something like, for example, the war in Israel and or the war in Ukraine, obviously there's going to be higher armament demands, right? As we're preparing for these wars, like even a war with China in Taiwan, it's going to be obvious that maybe investing in these corporations is actually a fairly decent idea right now because their demand is going to increase as the government's demand increases for arms, right? But the moral imperative here is that the more that the more that I invest in these corporations, it's the more power that they have to to demand unjust prices from our government for arms and things like that. So how do you feel about that? Does that all make you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if, for example, we're speaking of a person that is just starting to invest, I wouldn't advise that because in my opinion, that could be like a very, not very, but like a riskier investment rather than just investing in, I don't want to say names of corporations because I don't want to give that kind of advice.
I understand.
But there are other corporations that I would say it's safer rather than just this. But yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of doing that, of investing in this kind of corporations, yes, you're giving them more power, because at the end it involves so it's based on the price of the share, right? If the corporation is going to give you, or if your investment is going to give you a higher profit or not. So if there's more people, there's more demand being put into this kind of investments, then yeah. So I don't know. I wouldn't suggest you doing that because I'm against of giving these type of corporations so much power.
Right,
Yeah.
I agree. It's interesting to see if you look at things from the grand scale, it really is kind of it's systematic how the corporations, it's like they're going to win. Like they're going to win no matter what. Because if you're not investing yourself in them, right, to grow, then the government is just either way the government, the way that we have it right now is the arms dealers are charging way, way more than they need to be from the government, right? For the arms that they're selling to our government, and it's increasing the amount of taxes that we have it's increasing. Everything is increasing because of this inflation and things like that, and there's almost no way out other than to put a price control on the arms that they're receiving, right? But then again, that's very counter neoliberal, right? So it's a weird paradox here where
Yeah. I mean, I think a way that you can escape this, it's like maybe investing in other kind of businesses such as like maybe greener investments like green bonds. There are corporations like tiny corporations, or not even tiny, like entrepreneurships or other kind of businesses that we have the power as people to also decide what we would like to see in the world if we are investing already, right? So for example, something that I really like is just, yeah, investing in this kind of corporations, maybe that are just maybe invest in corporations that you really believe in instead of just putting your money in whatever just because it's going to grow. So if you think there's a company that speaks to your values and what you think, then that might be a good way of escaping this corporation driven world, right?
Okay. Seeing as we're running a little bit out of time here. I wanted to just close up everything by asking you. I want to ask you where your future is headed as far as your educational career, your career as a professor, and then maybe just some pieces of advice that you have for people that are entering this globalized world, right? Things to consider that you wouldn't want people to forget.
Yeah. So where I see my career, where I just moved to Santa Barbara to be a professor here in the Global Studies department. So for the future, I see myself like just
Here.
staying here a little. Yeah, just to be get like a stable life here. In terms of research, I would continuing working with the networks that I already have in the UK and Chile as well. So I would see myself like building projects with them. In terms of advices of people entering this globalized world, well, I don't know.
I can give one.
Yeah.
I can give one, and maybe that'll spark a little bit of feedback. Myself, I think like Professor Satyajit Singh says in his lectures, you have to learn. And especially with the globalized world that we're in now, the thing that is maybe being demanded of you from the social dynamics and things like that, it's going to be different than what may be demanded of you in the future. And so maybe one piece of advice just from my very preliminary studies is to be prepared to learn how to learn something different, because you have to keep yourself competitive. You have to be able to acquire new sets of knowledge if you want to be in demand in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. So that means as well, um, maybe being like very open to change. So for example, technology nowadays is playing a huge role in our life, like with AI and all that. Just maybe figuring out a way of how we can incorporate these new technologies and new everything that is like new coming up when we just move into the future, and to see a way of how we can integrate these, but in a good way, right? So if we're talking about technologies, then how we can make technologies, for example, in my field, like be better used for educational settings, and not just try to ignore them or just like block them, I don't know, um, from using it, right? So yeah, it's being prepared to learn something from a different perspective. Also, I would say like be very critic with everything you learn, because everything is rooted up, like built up in a context as well. So
Absolutely.
and so theories could apply today, but maybe not tomorrow. And this is something that we have to accept as like knowledge is dynamic as well, right? So it needs to keep evolving and keep adjusting to the context that we're seeing, right?
Okay, just due to time constraints, due to everyone being busy here, your time being in demand, my co-founder's time being in demand, I think that is a pretty decent place to end this conversation in particular. I want the viewers at home, everyone that's watching this, hey guys, thank you guys for watching this podcast. I am very, very pleased to have been able to provide an atmosphere for Nicole Cerpa Vielma to come and speak about her research, to come and speak about her opinions regarding the world, to speak about her opinions regarding academics in general, and then the future. I think that you have a very unique, obviously with the heterodox model, you represent a very unique epistemic community that needs more coverage, especially. And I'm really, really happy that FBMW is able to provide that coverage. If I have any piece of advice and final thoughts for all of our viewers that are watching, I really just want to amplify everything that you said and really just make sure to encourage everyone to think openly about the world, to think about this world extremely critically, and to look at the themes that are occurring around you, to look at the history of some of the institutions which you are involved with, and really understand that you are a piece to this puzzle, right? And there is a way to become a successful piece of that puzzle, not to just become a number in this massive equation. Would you say that's a fair
Yeah.
a fair ending?
No, yeah. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Yeah, and as people, we have the power of of collectively changing things as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, in terms of investments, in terms of knowledge, in terms of what voices also are being heard. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. With that, my name is Neo Harder, aka the Farm Boy. I'm joined by Dr. Nicole Cerpa Vielma. Thank you guys so much for watching FBMW. I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.
Thank